Today we're going to continue with subtitle B, Improving America's Moral Standing in the World. Section 334 deals with unethical weapons, and two main types are covered by this section that would prohibit the United States from purchasing or developing them, and that's landmines and lethal autonomous weapons. And so I want to talk about both of those separately, and then we'll take a look at the legislative language. So landmines have been around for a long time. According to the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, precursors were said to have been used as far back as the American Civil War, but they really started being more widespread in the world wars of the 20th century, predominantly the Second World War, and since then in Vietnam, in the Korean War, even the first Gulf War. During the Cold War, many states used these to just lay out long stretches of landmines between borders. Part of the theory was that this would reduce personnel costs, right? Instead of having to have somebody guarding your border, you could just put a whole bunch of mines out there and they would just automatically attack and blow up whenever somebody triggered one. And so that was the theory. But if you reduce the personnel costs, what are the compromises you're making to the ethical costs? How do you deal with those? Because landmines generally aren't designed specifically to kill as much as they are to maim. And one of the reasons for that is then you force your opponent to use up resources. You know, if you've got a whole troop of people advancing and one of them dies, then they can keep moving. But if you blow off somebody's leg, then you've created a new problem that your opponent has to deal with. How do they treat the wounded person? Do they bring them with? What do they do? You've created a new problem. And so landmines, in large part, are intended to intentionally harm other people for the sake of harm. And this has been a long-standing issue, not the least of which is that civilians are often the ones who get hurt by these. And so in 1997, nations of the world came together in Ottawa to develop a mine ban treaty. It is a legally binding international agreement. It bans the production, the stockpiling, and the transfer of anti-personnel mines, and it places obligations on countries to clear affected areas, assist victims, and destroy stockpiles. There's another way of looking at landmines is they can, when we talk about clearing affected areas, they're kind of sort of used to salt the earth. You remember how Romans would spread salt as they left their enemies' territory so that nothing could grow there. And to a certain extent, that's what landmines do too. They turn productive land into literally a minefield, an unproductive land. Landmines are also a violation of humanitarian law. Anti-personnel mines, they're indiscriminate, they're inhumane, and therefore they violate the basic elements of international humanitarian law. The law of war imposes certain restrictions on how combatants operate. It says combatants have to be able to distinguish between civilian and military targets, and that injuries inflicted should be proportionate with military objectives. And so anti-personnel mines, they fail both the discrimination and the proportionality tests. Going back to the mine ban treaty, the United States gave a number of reasons for backing out. Originally, they said, yes, they wanted to participate. And then they said, well, we'll participate, but we want this whole list of exceptions, the largest of which being Korea. I certainly wasn't alive back in the 1950s when the Korean War was going on, but the United States still says that landmines are an essential part of our objectives in Korea. And so the United States didn't end up adopting and supporting the mine ban treaty, but the United Nations adopted it in 1997. And as a result, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines won the Nobel Peace Prize that year for their work bringing this together. As of today, 164 nations are party to this treaty. As a treaty, it would require 2/3 of the U.S. Senate to ratify it. That's one of the reasons why it couldn't be in, ratification couldn't be included in a piece of legislation. It's a separate instrument. But there have been demonstrations of widespread support for it. Back in 2010, 58 Democrats in the Senate and 10 Republicans signed a letter asking President Obama to lay out a path for the United States to participate in the mine ban treaty. And unfortunately, things didn't get to the point where we actually ratified it. The Democrats lost a bunch of seats in the midterm elections, and it just kind of fell through the cracks. Although President Obama did use executive orders to stop purchases of landmines and to restrict their use to just Korea. Again, we're still fixated on Korea from this 1950s conflict. Sort of like, as a parent, if you told your kids, you can't come out of your room until you're sorry. Like, how long would you keep a child locked in their room before you'd recognize that your attempt at discipline wasn't having the intended effect? It's something that America ought to think about all these decades and generations later. Anyways, when President Donald Trump he issued an executive order that reversed a lot of these things and allowed for the United States to start and stockpiling landmines again. And this goes back to what we've discussed in a number of other sections, which is why it's important to put these policy changes in law so they're not subject to the whims of the executive, that one president from the next can't just keep changing the policy. And so that's what this legislation would do. It would prohibit buying landmines and other unethical weapons. Before we look at the actual legislative language, talk about the other unethical weapon that this applies to, and these are lethal autonomous weapons. If you've ever seen a Terminator movie, you can imagine the Terminators as autonomous weapons whose sole purpose is to hunt down human beings and kill them. And we have the technology to do those sort of things today. The New York Times reported last year that Israel assassinated a top Iranian nuclear scientist at the end of 2020 using a remotely controlled AI-assisted machine gun, where they set it up to figure out when his car was coming down the road, and when it identified him, shot him and killed him. And the argument in favor of this is, well, the alternative was blowing up the vehicle and there were innocent civilians in the vehicle. So by just using AI to assassinate just one person, that causes less harm. But there are a lot of reasons why we don't want to open this door, or we don't want to go down this path of AI-assisted killing of human beings. The website autonomousweapons.org offers 7 different reasons why, about warnings about different dangers. And I'd just like to go through their list real quickly. First is unpredictability. Skynet from the Terminator movies, right? Is you put the AI in charge, and then if it someday decides that it's the humans that are the real threat, then you never know what could happen. Anytime that you're putting software in charge of making life and death decisions, there is unpredictability. And we saw self-driving cars that occasionally make mistakes, but those are mistakes. Lethal autonomous weapons, their primary purpose is to be weapons, to cause harm, to kill. And so this is an area that you don't want that to happen unpredictably. The second of their dangers is escalation. And the stock market, this happens in the stock market occasionally, where automated trading programs get triggered by something another automated trading program is doing. And then all of a sudden you get these big wild swings in the stock market because it's machines acting to machines faster than and just escalating things. And if those machines are the kind that are designed to kill human beings, this is not an area where you would want rapid escalation outside of human control. Another danger is proliferation. The more of these that we put out there, that the more of these that are developed, the greater the likelihood that they'll end up in the hands of dictators, terrorists, people who will use them specifically in disruptive ways, and instead of sort of nominally the way that we'd like to think the United States will use them as tools of defense. Another risk is this would create lower barriers to conflict. Rather than having to recruit a whole army full of soldiers, you can just send out swarms of AI to go out and fight your battles for you, which leads to another risk of mass destruction, where again, you don't need one person for each weapon that you're utilizing. One person can control many weapons, since AI would be doing most of the heavy lifting. One of the biggest dangers, though, is probably the selective targeting of groups, where artificial intelligence could be used to target people based on age, gender, race, ethnicity, even religious dress, and target them that way. Again, the argument would be, well, if you could just target the enemy's soldiers based on their uniform, then that would be a good use of this. But once we open Pandora's box, a lot of really dangerous and scary things that can come out, and so it's best to keep it shut. The last warning danger that they have on their site talks about an AI arms race. And if we get into an arms races, that the very dynamic, it favors speed over safety. Let's get it done as fast as we can. We're in a race, as opposed to taking the time to think about what we should be doing. What's the line from Jurassic Park? Your scientists were so concerned about whether or not they didn't stop to think about whether or not they should. This is not, again, lethal autonomous weapons are not an area where we want to encourage that sort of putting speed over safety. It's also been argued that, it's also been pointed out that these systems, they violate the dictates of conscience and undermine the principles of humanity, because they wouldn't be able to apply compassion or human judgment to decisions to use force. These are human characteristics. The International Red Cross has recommended that states regulate lethal autonomous weapons, and they have 3 core pillars. First is no human targets. Second is to restrict unpredictability. And the third is to require human control. And I'd like to go ahead and pull up the legislation. We can look at how we try and do that with this section. All right, so we've got prohibiting purchase of landmines and lethal autonomous weapons. Now, this section of the United States Code deals with procurement. And so it would be a restriction on the kind of things that we could buy, specifically contracts, any contracts that would include development or procurement of unethical weapons. Statement of purpose that humans, not machines, are legal and moral agents in military operations and are responsible for ensuring and understanding that any attack complies with the laws of war. This language and a bunch of some of the definitions in this section come from a paper, Autonomous Weapon Systems, a road mapping exercise, which was published in 2019 on Georgia Tech's Robot Lab website. And they came up with some good defining language, so we used it here. So the United States would be prohibited from developing or procuring unethical weapons, and we define unethical weapons as devices which are intended to maim, kill, or otherwise injure a human being without direct action initiated by a human operator. Again, back to the International Red Cross recommendation of requiring human control. It specifically exempts things like missile defense systems, where the goal of an automatic response is towards a missile or other inanimate object, not a person. Those are specifically, explicitly exempt. Development means the active process of creating and includes designs that enable conversion from compliant to non-compliant categories solely by software updates. It is important that you can't just upgrade, build the system and just leave out one software patch that would make it a lethal autonomous weapon. Require that it was physically incapable of being upgraded to a lethal autonomous weapon. Couldn't just be done by software. And then defining the term lethal autonomous weapons means weapon systems that, once activated, select and engage human targets without further intervention by a human operator. As far as penalties, we put a $1 million fine for any violation, a minimum of a $1 million fine to go to the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, and a requirement that any of all the specifications about any violation, including the quantity, cost, technical details, would all be turned over to the International Campaign to Ban Landmines. So if this were violated, the information should then be made public. And yeah, so that's what this section does. The best time to address this was 5 years ago, and best time is this year. It needs to be done. We have an opportunity to be leaders, to set an example for the rest of the world and say, we're not going to go down this road. We're not going to buy these. We're not going to develop these. To quote Sarah Connor from the Terminator movies, there is no fate but what we make. And this is really an opportunity for us to improve our moral standing in the world. So with that, Mixed Chair, I think that concludes my testimony for section 334. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question. If we don't develop this technology and other countries do, won't we be at a disadvantage?
Yeah, I mean, there's a non-zero chance of that. If you ever seen the movie Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, the Russians developed this doomsday device, and as the Dr. Strangelove, figures out what are the consequences, and we should build mine shafts. The Russians are probably already building mine shafts where people can live out this nuclear apocalypse. And so his line is, we must not allow a mine shaft gap. Like there's some other country is doing it, we've got to always keep up with them. And, well, what if we don't? What if we don't? We're the ones who don't escalate. Thinking the worst of others, expecting the worst from other people, from other countries, that's a policy choice. And instead, we can make a policy choice to be a force for peace and good and calm, rational decisions in the world.
If we are banning lethal autonomous weapons that engage human targets, can they develop weapons that target other things that aren't people, like a killer drone designed to fly around a city and find a certain make and model of a car, check the license plate, and blow it up?
Yes, the prohibition here is specifically on engaging human targets, so that you can exempt things like missile defense systems. Fortunately, yes, that's the answer.